War rarely announces itself in the way stories suggest. It does not usually begin with a clear declaration or a single dramatic moment. Instead, it grows out of routines that already exist. Long before armies move, money moves. Grain moves. Records move. Decisions are made quietly by clerks and officials whose names are never remembered. By the time weapons appear, the war has already been underway for years in a different form. It has been prepared through habits of payment and expectation that feel ordinary to those who live within them. The greatest military powers in history were not defined by how fiercely they fought but by how calmly they paid. A state that can promise regular wages can keep men under arms even when enthusiasm fades. A government that can collect revenue without resistance can sustain campaigns that last longer than a single generation. This realization did not come from theory. It emerged through failure. Early rulers learned that sudden demands for wealth provoked unrest and collapse. Populations could tolerate hardship, but not shock. From this lesson grew a method of financing war that depended on invisibility rather than force. The key was normalization. When a cost is constant, it stops being questioned. A small tax paid every year becomes part of life. A service obligation inherited from parent to child becomes tradition. Over time, the reason for these obligations fades from memory. What began as an emergency measure becomes a social fact. War disappears from the language even as its financial structures remain firmly in place. Agriculture played a central role in this transformation. Control of food meant control of time. Grain stores allowed armies to move beyond the limits of local harvests. More importantly, they allowed states to plan years ahead. When a government could count next winter harvest before it was planted, it could commit to long campaigns without fear of immediate scarcity. Farmers rarely saw their contribution as military. They delivered grain because they always had. The grain moved onward to garrisons and supply trains without ceremony. In this way, entire rural populations became logistical partners in war without ever meeting a soldier. Taxation evolved alongside food control. Early taxes were blunt and visible. Later systems became subtle and layered. Customs duties raised prices slightly rather than openly demanding payment. Coinage debasement reduced value without changing numbers. Fees were attached to transactions rather than lives. People paid while believing they were simply participating in commerce. The connection to war was distant and abstract. What mattered was that payment continued. Credit completed the system. Once states learned to borrow against future revenue, war escaped the limits of the present. A campaign no longer needed to be paid for by those currently alive. Its cost could be transferred forward in time. Lenders accepted this arrangement because states had learned to appear permanent. As long as the machinery of taxation continued to turn, repayment seemed inevitable. Debt transformed war from a test of immediate strength into a test of administrative endurance. This change altered the moral experience of conflict. When citizens are asked directly to fund a war, they question its purpose. When the same funds are extracted indirectly, the question never arises. A rise in bread prices feels like misfortune. A new toll feels like inconvenience. Few connect these sensations to distant battlefields. Responsibility dissolves across millions of transactions. No individual feels accountable, and therefore no individual resists. Empires that mastered this approach could fight not only enemies but time itself. Short wars could be absorbed easily. Long wars became background noise. Even defeat did not necessarily end the process. A losing state could continue paying soldiers long after victory was impossible, sustained by credit and routine. Collapse came only when trust in the system failed, not when armies fell. Administrative language played a subtle role. Terms like defense and security replaced the word war. Payments were described as contributions or duties. Military spending merged into general budgets. Once money lost its label, it lost its emotional weight. People no longer asked what their taxes supported. They only asked whether the collection was fair relative to others. War financing became a question of equity rather than purpose. Religion and tradition often reinforced this quiet acceptance. Obligations were framed as moral duties. Paying became an act of loyalty or righteousness rather than calculation. In some societies, refusing payment was seen as a personal failing rather than a political statement. This moral framing insulated the financial system from critique even during times of hardship. Over generations, the system refined itself. Census records improved. Property measurement became precise. Population movement was tracked. Each improvement reduced friction. Each reduction made extraction easier and resistance less likely. War grew more expensive, but also more sustainable. The paradox was that efficiency increased suffering at scale while reducing suffering at the individual level in any single moment. No one felt crushed, yet millions were continuously drained. The soldiers themselves occupied an unusual position. They experienced war directly, yet they were also products of the same financial habits. Their wages arrived regularly. Their equipment was issued predictably. Many came to see war not as catastrophe but as employment. When war ended, unemployment followed. In such conditions, peace could feel more dangerous than conflict. This emotional reversal further stabilized the system. Urban populations played a different role. Cities provided credit, manufacturing, and administrative labor. Merchants profited from supply contracts. Artisans relied on military demand. Entire urban economies became linked to continuous conflict. Opposition weakened when livelihoods depended on continuation. War ceased to be a national emergency and became an economic environment. None of this required conspiracy. The system emerged through incremental decisions made for practical reasons. Each step seemed reasonable. Each reform solved an immediate problem. No one needed to plan a permanent war economy. It assembled itself naturally as soon as states prioritized continuity over resolution. Once assembled, it resisted dismantling because too many functions depended on it. The result was a new form of power that could persist even when rulers changed. Kings died. Governments fell. Yet the financial routines endured. Taxes were still collected. Debt was still honored. Armies were still paid. War became impersonal, detached from individual ambition. It survived because it had become infrastructure. This infrastructure shaped how history unfolded. Conflicts extended across decades not because of hatred but because the cost of stopping exceeded the cost of continuing. Peace required restructuring systems that people depended on. War required only maintenance. As long as payments flowed, the machinery moved. Eventually some societies reached the limits of this model. Excessive debt strained credibility. Tax burdens accumulated faster than productivity. Inflation eroded trust. When confidence collapsed, war financing collapsed with it. These moments were sudden and dramatic, reinforcing the illusion that war itself had caused the fall. In reality, the cause was financial exhaustion rather than military defeat. Understanding this history challenges comforting narratives. It suggests that war persists not because people desire it, but because they adapt to it financially. The true engine of conflict is not aggression but normalization. When violence is paid for quietly, it becomes invisible. When it becomes invisible, it becomes permanent. The lesson is not limited to the past. Any system that distributes cost thinly and continuously can sustain actions that would be rejected if presented honestly. The battlefield is only the visible surface of a much deeper structure. Beneath it lies a network of payments, records, and expectations that decide how long conflict can last. War ends when this structure breaks, not when the last battle is fought. It ends when people once again feel the cost directly and ask whether it is worth paying. Until that moment arrives, history shows that war can continue without hatred, without enthusiasm, and even without victory. It continues because it has learned how to live quietly among ordinary things.